Hello, everyone. I am married, and I don't want my wife, but the woman I work with.
I am married. And that no longer sounds like a support. It is simply a fact that exists alongside another fact. I want the woman I work with. Not an image, not a fantasy, not an abstraction. A concrete person who I see almost every day. And the longer it goes on, the harder it is to pretend that nothing is happening. The worst thing is not the attraction itself. The worst thing is the feeling of the moment being close. As if everything is already on the edge, and the question is not in the decision, but in the circumstance. In chance. In one evening, in one conversation, in one wrong step. I catch myself thinking not how to avoid this, but how could this happen? And this change in thinking is frightening. I began to behave differently, even before any actions. Not abruptly. Not demonstratively. There was just a coldness that was difficult to explain. I began to look at my wife less. I listened less. It was easier for me to be silent than to maintain a conversation. Not because she annoys me. And because there is already a different tension inside, and there is simply not enough space for everything else. I see how it changes the atmosphere at home. Not because of scandals. Because of silence. Because of indifference. Because I am more and more often physically present, but absent internally. And I know that this is noticeable. It is impossible to hide a person who is no longer here for a long time. At work, the tension is different. There I constantly control myself. Gestures, gaze, distance. And the stronger the control, the greater the fatigue. I live in a mode of constant restraint, and it corrodes. Because restraint does not remove desire. It only makes it more obsessive. I catch myself starting to build scenarios. Not plans, scenarios. Imaginary situations where everything somehow happened. Without direct responsibility. Without a solution. This is the most dangerous form of self-deception, because it removes guilt even before the act. And I see how easily the brain adjusts reality to these scenarios. This problem is no longer limited to two people. It slowly creeps into everything. I have become more irritable. Less patient. I avoid meetings with loved ones because I don't want to answer simple questions. I feel my future, which used to be clear and understandable, begin to blur. Not because I want to change it, but because I stop believing in it. The hardest thing is the realization that I am destroying not only relationships, but also my own image. I am no longer confident in myself. I cannot say, I know how I will act. Because I see how dependent I am on the moment. And this knowledge takes away support. I am not the hero of this story and not the victim. I am a person who has allowed one thought to live for too long. And now this thought controls my reactions, my behavior, my attitude towards my wife, towards work, towards myself. And the scariest thing is that I feel like the point of no return may not be loud. It may look like a normal day. Nothing has happened yet. But everything feels like it's just a pause. And every day it becomes harder to maintain that pause. I began to notice that I no longer return home with the same state in which I left in the morning. Before, work ended at the door. Now it leaves with me. Not in the form of work or fatigue, in the form of tension that I cannot leave outside. And this tension has no outlet except silence. I have become more silent. Not because there is nothing to say, but because any conversation seems superfluous. I answer briefly, look away, listen half-heartedly. And the longer it goes on, the more it looks like a choice, not an accident. It is as if I push myself away so as not to feel guilty. Because when you are closer, it is harder to hide your absence. I see how my wife's behavior changes. She does not make scenes. She does not arrange interrogations. She simply becomes more cautious. And this is worse than any conflict. Because caution means that something has already been noticed. That the distance is felt. And that she is trying not to scare me even more. I am annoyed by this caution. Not because it is unfair. But because it is precise. It gets into the place that I try not to touch. And instead of getting closer, I close myself even more. It is a closed circle that I see but do not stop. At work, everything looks different. There I am tense, collected, attentive. I constantly monitor the distance. But at the same time I feel how any little thing can become a trigger. A look that lingers for a second longer. A conversation that goes beyond the limits. A shared moment that could be overlooked, but I notice. I increasingly think that the main danger is not in desire, but in getting used to it. It no longer causes shock. It has become the background. And when something becomes the background, you stop fighting it. You begin to live alongside it, correcting the behavior, not the problem. I began to justify my own coldness. Telling myself that this is just a difficult period. That everyone is going through this separation. That nothing terrible is happening. But these explanations don't work until the end. Because I know where it's coming from. And I know that it's not just like that. I'm scared of how easily the brain adapts. How quickly it stops asking questions. How quickly, "I didn't cheat," becomes the only argument that still holds the structure together. And this argument is weak. Because it doesn't talk about loyalty. It only talks about the lack of action. For now. I'm increasingly thinking not about the consequences, but about scenarios. About how everything could look if something happens. Not in detail, in general terms. And the very fact that these thoughts arise means that the line is no longer where it was before. This tension has begun to affect everything. I sleep worse. I get tired faster. I react more sharply. It's harder for me to be normal. And the worst thing is, I understand that this is noticeable. Not only to my wife. To those around me. To people who have known me for a long time. I feel like I'm gradually losing control not over the situation, but over myself. Not because of impulsiveness. Because of a constant internal struggle that is exhausting. And the more I try to keep everything within limits, the more these limits crack. The problem is no longer that I want another woman. The problem is that this desire has begun to dictate who I become. How I behave. How I look at my life. And every day it becomes harder to imagine that everything will return to the state as before. Not because I will take a step, but because I have already gone too far mentally. And this feeling is the most dangerous. Because it creates the illusion of inevitability. As if the decision has already been made, and I am just stalling for time. I no longer think that it can be stopped simply by willpower. That idea died. Not abruptly, but quietly. At some point, I realized that it's not a matter of whether I'm holding back. It's that I already live as if holding back is temporary. I don't wait for the moment. I carry it with me. I wake up with this tension and go to bed with it. It doesn't ask if it's okay today. It just is. And the worst thing is that I've stopped feeling aversion to it. It no longer seems like something foreign. It has become part of the background, like the tinnitus you get used to. My wife is there, but there's no longer an emptiness between us, there's a wall between us. Not emotional, not dramatic. Practical. I don't share. I don't explain. I don't let her in. And this isn't protecting the marriage. This is protecting me from having to look her in the eye honestly. I catch myself thinking that I started avoiding her not because of feelings, but because of comparison. Any conversation seems superfluous. Any intimacy is inappropriate. Not because it is bad, but because it is no longer the center. And that is the cruelest thing, not hatred, but the loss of the center. Everything is easier at work. There is no need to pretend. There is no need to hold a grudge. There I allow myself to be collected, tense, alive. And yes, I know that this is not reciprocity, not a romance, not a story. But that does not matter. Because desire does not ask permission from logic. I no longer look away. I no longer catch myself thinking this is wrong. That too has disappeared. Instead, another has appeared, this is inevitable. And this thought is scarier than any fantasy, because it removes responsibility before the action. I began to live as if my marriage were a circumstance, not a choice. As if it were just a background that had no right to interfere with what was happening inside me. And I hate myself for it. Not loudly. Not pompously. Quietly. Constantly. My life no longer feels whole. It feels disjointed. Here is work and stress. Here is home and cold. Here is me, who can't put it all together. And I understand that this is not a temporary state. This is a new configuration. I became a worse man even before I became a traitor. And this is the truth, from which there is nowhere to escape. Because betrayal is an action. And destruction is a process. And the process is already underway. I see how it affects everything. On my decisions. On my concentration. On my future, which I no longer imagine. I have stopped thinking ahead, because any later seems like a lie. I live in a present tense mode, where there is only one question, when? And the worst thing is that I no longer feel like I am doing something exceptional. It has ceased to be a drama. It has become commonplace. And mundanity is the most dangerous state for any boundary. I don't know what will happen next. But I know for sure that there is no going back. Not because I did something. But because I have become someone who can do it without internal resistance. And this feeling is not the culmination. This is the base from which my life now lives. I no longer respect myself. Not emotionally, structurally. As one respects or disrespects a construction that no longer holds its shape. I look at myself and see a person who says one thing, lives another, and thinks another. And the worst thing is not an internal conflict. It is a habituation to it. My conscience no longer torments me as it should. It does not scream. It simply retreated. It left behind an empty space that anger filled. Not aggression. Cold, quiet anger, at myself, at my marriage, at the situation that I did not leave, but began to live in. I began to look at my wife and feel irritation where it had not been before. Not because of her words or actions. Because of the very fact of her presence. Because she reminds me of a version of myself that I no longer am. And instead of hating myself for it, I begin to internally push her away. This is the lowest form of defense, to shift the burden onto someone who is not to blame for anything. I catch myself thinking that I have started to look for flaws in her. Not in order to leave, but to justify my own coldness. This is not an active process. It is automatic. And when you notice that the brain is doing this on its own, it becomes clear that the destruction has already gone far. I no longer believe in then. Before, the future was something worth protecting. Now it seems like something abstract, almost superfluous. Not because I want to break everything, but because I have stopped imagining a holistic version of myself in it. I am either here or there. And in between, emptiness. At work, tension has ceased to be something special. It has become the background in which I function. I no longer try to avoid thoughts. I allow them to be. And this is scarier than any action. Because when you stop fighting, you actually agree. I began to think not about the consequences of betrayal, but about the consequences of not cheating. About how much longer I could live in this duality. About how much longer I could play the role of the man who is present. And these thoughts look less and less convincing. Because they have no way out. I destroyed my sense of security even before I destroyed my marriage. I destroyed trust even before I cheated. And now any outcome looks like a loss. If I do it, I am a traitor. If I don't, I am a person who has betrayed myself and everyone around me internally, but left everything as it is. I have ceased to be reliable even to myself. I can no longer say, I know who I am. I only know who I do not want to be, and who I am becoming every day. It is a state in which it is difficult to breathe. Not because of emotions. Because of the constant tension of being someone you no longer feel like you are. Neither logic nor fear can save me. I see the consequences, I imagine the pain, I know what will happen next. But knowledge no longer works as a brake. It works as background noise. And decisions made against a background of noise are always destructive. I look ahead and I don't see a version of the future where everything worked out. There are only options where something is lost. The question is not what exactly. The question is when I will finally stop pretending that I still have the situation. I am not waiting for a catastrophe. It has already happened. Just without a sound. Without a moment. Without a point after which one could say, this is where everything broke. Because it broke gradually. And now I live inside this crack. And the worst thing is that even if nothing happens physically, I have already done enough for this life to no longer be whole. And this knowledge will not go away. At some point, I realized that I no longer think in terms of do or not do. These words have lost their meaning. They sound as if there is still room for maneuver. And there is no longer any. There is only the state in which I live, and options that do not fundamentally change anything. I no longer feel like I am choosing. I feel like I am agreeing. With who I have become. With what my life looks like. With the fact that the tension will not disappear even if nothing happens. And this feeling is worse than any fear, because it deprives me of the illusion of control. I used to think that the main problem was desire. Now I see that I was wrong. Desire is just a symptom. The real problem is that I have ceased to be a person who is able to hold something inside without breaking. I have not learned to live with tension. I have allowed it to rewrite me. I look at my life and see that it is already broken in a key place. Not externally, structurally. I no longer feel whole. There are fragments that do not fit together. Home, separately. Work, separately. I, separately. And I no longer try to put it together, because I know it will come out false. I notice how my language has changed. How I talk about the future, about plans, about us. Everything sounds conditional. Without obligations. Without warmth. As if I leave myself room to escape, even if I don't go anywhere. And this is probably the clearest marker that the choice has already been made, just not voiced. I stopped looking for a way out. Not because I don't want to, but because I don't believe in a clean option. In any scenario, someone will be broken. And this someone is no longer an abstraction. It's me. It's my wife. It's our environment, which feels the tension but doesn't see the reason. And I no longer comfort myself with the thought that it's possible to get out of this without losses. It scares me how quickly I started to accept this as the norm. As a new baseline. As a state in which to live. Bad, but livable. People can get used to any form of pain, as long as it's stable. And I got used to it. It's not a victory. It's a surrender. I can see how it's changing me as a person. I'd become less sensitive. Less involved. It's easier for me to distance myself than to be honest. And the longer this goes on, the less likely I am to return to the previous version of myself. Not because it was perfect. but because it no longer corresponds to who I have become. I no longer ask myself if this is right. That question has lost its weight. I ask myself how much longer this will last and how much longer I can endure this mode. And the answers are not reassuring. Because any answer means that the problem is not an episode, but a state. I realize that even if there is no betrayal, the ending is already spoiled. Because I live with a thought that has no way out. I live with a desire that cannot simply be endured. And this desire is no longer about a woman. It is about losing boundaries. About losing myself. I look at all this and see that there is no longer a right choice. There are only different kinds of defeat. And the realization of this does not free. It only takes away the last illusion that I still have control over something. I do not know how this will end. But I do know one thing, even if everything remains the same on the outside, I have already paid enough not to call it done. Because there are things after which you continue to live, but in a different configuration. And there is no returning to the starting point. The worst part is that nothing exploded. There is no scene after which you can say that everything is over. There is no point where the story logically closes. Life just moved on. And that was the hardest part. I stayed married. At least formally. I didn't take a step after which everything would be obvious. And from the outside it looks like a victory. Like self-control. Like I've coped. But from the inside it doesn't feel that way. Because the problem hasn't gone away. It just stopped being an event and became the background. I learned to live with it. Not to solve it, to get used to it. That doesn't mean it got easier. That means it got quieter. The tension didn't go away, it was distributed evenly. It no longer tears from the inside, it's just constantly present. Like pressure that you stop noticing until it's too late. Intimacy never emerged between my wife and I. And not because we didn't try. And because I was no longer honest even in my attempts. I couldn't go back to where she was the center. Not because I didn't want to. But because the center had already shifted, and I didn't know how to get it back. I became careful with my words. Careful with my gestures. Careful about the future. I no longer make promises that sound too far-fetched. I speak as if I'm leaving myself a backup plan, even if I don't plan on using it. And I know it feels that way. Maybe not right away. But it does. At work, it's the same. The tension hasn't gone away. It's just become a part of my day. I don't fight it anymore. I just keep the distance I've learned to maintain. It's not a victory. It's a compromise that slowly eats away at my self-respect. I don't think the problem is solved. I think it's either lived with or destroyed. And I'm not sure which is worse. Because a life of constant restraint is also a form of destruction. Just without the obvious fragments. My future no longer looks clear. Not because I destroyed it. But because I no longer trust myself as I used to. I can't say that I know how I will behave in a critical moment. And this knowledge changes everything. Because before I believed in myself. Now I only observe. I see how people around me live, make plans, talk about, forever. And I am silent. Not because I don't want to. But because the word forever no longer sounds honest in my head. And I am not ready to lie even in small things. This story is not about betrayal. It is about the moment when you learn something about yourself that you cannot forget. About a version of yourself that turned out to be real. And after that you can't go back. You can only live on, knowing that this crack will not go anywhere. I didn't become worse in other people's eyes. I didn't become better in my own. I just became different. People often think that the end is an event. But sometimes the end is a state that lasts for years. And the most honest thing I can say is, this problem hasn't gone away. It won't go away. And now it's a part of my life that I'll either learn to live with or it will slowly eat away at whatever's left. This isn't a story with a conclusion. This is a story with consequences.